Ya, silakan.
Hello. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good evening to audience in the Netherlands, and I believe it's past midnight in Indonesia, and to other people participating from all parts of the world. Welcome to the Young-led Netherlands-Indonesia Climate Partnership Webinar, today, 10th of July 2019. This is the second session of a webinar series, which is jointly organized by Energy Academy Indonesia and TY Consultant. And with us, we have two prominent speakers here. The first one is Mr. Dedi Mahardika, who is the climate researcher at World Resource Institute Indonesia. He supports the research and engagement activities of climate programs, especially in projects of partnership to strengthen transparency and co-innovation, or PASTI, tracking and strengthening climate action, or TASCA, as well as low carbon development initiative, LCDI. Dedi holds an MSc degree in environmental engineering from Kyungpook University in Daegu, South Korea. And we also have the other speaker, which is Dr. Sylvia Karlsson-Vinkhuyzen, who is an assistant professor with the Public Administration and Policy Group of Wageningen University. In her research, Sylvia tries to understand what makes global governance processes have influence and build legitimacy. A central theme is the role of civil society participation and related issues such as transparency and accountability. Sylvia has her Ph.D. in political science from Linköping University, Sweden, and has published in the domains of global energy, climate change, biodiversity, and sustainable development governance. She is also active in civil society by being board member in several NGOs. And my name is Nila Kamil. I will be the lead and moderator for this session. I'm a PhD candidate at Environmental Policy Group, Wageningen University, the Netherlands. My research focuses on the effects of multiple level transparency systems toward climate action in developing countries. And I will provide brief introductions on what we are going to discuss today. Let me share my screen first. Sorry. Okay. Here is the webinar schedule and topics. So on 19th of June, we have already held the first session, which is under the topic of leadership and climate change, led by Tom Damon, Youth for Climate, and today's second webinar, and we will have 6 webinars in total. And to the topic of today.
Sorry, Nila, maybe you can slideshow your...
Yes, sorry, yeah. Okay, so why climate change is the most pressing problem of our time, and it's a global problem that requires collective efforts to tackle. The problem is how we can ensure that there's no free rider in these collective efforts, and that parties, by parties here I mean countries, but also business sectors and other even individual level, are going to do what they said they're going to do, and then how we can ensure the ambitiousness of actions pledged and also implemented. And then transparency. There's the underlying assumptions surrounding transparency that the more is the better. But transparency in climate action is used to make climate actions visible and to trace and track, track the performance in mitigating climate change and also in adapting to climate effects, and to foster understanding and learning through sharing of experience and lessons learned. But transparency is also assumed to promote greater accountability. And here is the Paris Agreement Enhanced Transparency Framework. So Paris is a turning point where almost all countries agree to move forward to reach the global goal of limiting warming below 2 degrees Celsius, well below 2 degrees Celsius, and aiming to 1.5 degrees. And we see the transparency framework development from one-way reporting of national actions, to report and review of national contribution. And there's a where previously there's a bifurcated mechanism for developed and developing countries into a common standardized system for all. And transparency is also going to fit in the global stocktake, which will be elaborated more by Sylvia, and to meet the to bring compliance of countries involved. And this is the transparency's existing mechanism. This on the left side, what is being reported is the national inventories of greenhouse gases and information necessary to track progress of NDC or nationally determined contributions. And actually, there's also information on impact and adaptation actions. But for the scope of our session today, we focus on NDC mitigation only. And also to report supports provided and mobilized by developed countries and supports needed and received from developing countries. And the review process comprised of technical reviews of inventories, technical reviews of biennial transparency reports, and the facilitative multilateral considerations of progress. So now we are going to look at how Indonesia implements transparency requirements, because for developing countries, this report and review of their climate actions is considered as a new requirement, and their perception of limited capacity and weak data and information governance in developing countries. And there was lack of clear, which is now there's a Paris rule book, but it's only recently been agreed upon. So there's a lack of clear modalities, procedures, and guidelines. And for these, I will ask Dedi now to present about Indonesia's transparency framework implementation. Please, Dedi.
Okay. Oh, yes. Okay. May I start now? Yeah, okay. Thank you, Nila, for the time. Good evening, everyone around the world, and good early evening here. I'm in Tokyo right now. So, yeah. First, my name is Dedi. I'm working for the WRI Indonesia World Resources Institute. We're working mostly in the environmental problems, not only climate, but also energy, forest restoration, and also some other related issues in Indonesia. And as Nila mentioned also, I will talk about the work in WRI Indonesia, specifically about what is the current situation of transparency in Indonesia. So I guess I'll share my screen first. Okay. Yeah, okay. Yeah, first thing first, maybe I'll talk about the global challenges and opportunities, which I believe Sylvia will also mention about this one later. But in terms of the global challenges and opportunities related with the transparency in Indonesia, it's always related to the Paris Agreement, which is solid transparency is a prerequisite for delivering on the Paris Agreement. And based on that one, we are also discussing more about the implications for non-state actors. In Indonesia, non-state actors included in the both companies or corporate sector, as well as the subnational government. So both of the non-state actors really have implications for the based on the soil transparency itself. What's needed actually is that countries committed significantly improve more detailed guidance. So especially Indonesia as a developing countries, it needs more guidance about how to implement the soil transparency framework in Indonesia. And based on that one, what is the key findings and also key gap here is actually to have a successful implementation of the Paris Agreement transparency, there needs to be an adequate and sustainable financial support and capacity building. In this case, as mentioned also by Nila, WRI Indonesia is currently working in the transparency project called Pasti, or Partnership to Strengthen Transparency for Co-Innovations. In that project, we support the transparency framework, especially in the reporting system side. Why? Maybe I will talk about that one later, but in terms of the reporting system, there needs still to be some key challenges here that needs to be addressed. So the research that we do here is that we found that Indonesian government and companies can create a data and ambition loop here. What is the data and ambition loop? Here is basically how the government and business send signals to each other. Of course, government will have the climate policies and also related to the climate target, what will be the regulatory environment, and also related to the incentives here. So government, of course, will have their own agenda and their own targets, but they need to really deliver the target to the business people here, which will then take a climate action here. So there are several climate action initiatives around the world. Maybe the one that really famous for doing some science is science-based targets, and also CDP, or formerly known as the Carbon Disclosure Project. So the business or climate action is taking those initiatives to really send back the signal to the government of Indonesia. So they will have a climate action, ambitious science-based target, and also publicly updates on the progress. And based on that one, the government will know that the business also taking care of the climate action. And therefore, based on those signals, the government can raise more ambitions to the overall climate action. And this loop will continue until the government of Indonesia reach the overall targets of the climate action here. So basically in this one, the data loop where the private sector provides needed data for MRV is being recommended here based on the study by the ambition loop. But of course, to be able to have this data and ambition loop concept to be implemented, there needs to be specific conditions right now. But what are the conditions of MRV system in Indonesia? We talk about this one a lot, I think, but in Indonesia's MRV system, of course, we have planning and budgeting, of course, first, which mostly being handled by the ministries related with the finance and also economies. So we have Krishna 2020 and also SMART, which is a platform for both planning and budgeting. But the focus of the Indonesia Transparency Framework right now is the reporting system. As you may see in your screen right now, we have 5 different reporting systems across 4 different line of ministries. So yeah, it's a lot of work for the private sector to really report almost similar data sets to those 5 different reporting systems. For example, one of the company can really report one specific data about energy to POME and Applegatry. But they need to submit similar data sets, but with a very different methodologies. So that really hinders the participation of the companies in the climate action overall. So in this case, the work in PASTI is to how we enhance the participation of the private sector by studying what's the possibility to have a single reporting system here. So at this stage of the project, I think the 5 of the reporting system is already talk to each other, which further enhance what the future collaborations will be. And of course, aside from the planning, budgeting, and reporting, there needs to be monitoring inventory, mostly done by the Ministry of Forestry and Environment of Indonesia. Okay, we can go to the next slide. This is the findings of our desk study, actually. As you may see in the screen right now, the similar data sets in each of the reporting system are being submitted by the non-state actors here. Yeah, it is clearly really shown that the 4 different reporting systems have almost similar data sets. So, of course, this will also give some difficulties to the private sectors, because not only it's a time-consuming to develop each of the reporting mechanism methodologies, but it needs also more effort in the budgeting for the companies. So at the bottom of the screen, you may already seen that the working that we do here is to create one gate reporting system that will help the data synchronization and to increase the non-state actors' participation. Currently, the work that we do in Indonesia is to what will be the best approach for the one gate reporting system right now. There are several recommendations for the one gate reporting system. The 2 of them is actually the consideration whether we will build a new system or we just continue the existing system of the currently available of reporting. So yeah, we're still in the middle of that one. But for now, I think the most important way is how we help the private sector to have a single reporting system and to really help the private sector and therefore to participate in the climate action, and therefore overall will enhance the transparency framework in Indonesia. The work in one gate reporting system right now is the approach is not only to get the insight from the high level ranks, but also we disseminate the result and also discussing the concept of one gate reporting system with the technical expert from each of the reporting system. Therefore, we really discuss what's the possibility of the data sets that could be really elaborated in each other. And of course, we will also disseminate the result of the one gate reporting system process to the companies and private sectors in general to really get their idea. So yeah, for now, the progress of the transparency in Indonesia is still in the reporting system, because this is really crucial to be able to increase the transparency framework in Indonesia. Yeah, I think that's for my presentation. Should you have any further inquiries or questions related to the transparency in Indonesia, you may contact down my email below. Okay. Okay, that's it for me. I think for now I can give the go back to Nila.
Yes, thank you so much, Daddy. That is very enlightening. And I would just like to remind to our audiences that we have live chat in YouTube. So if you have questions or comments or inputs, please post in the YouTube channel of ECADIN, or Energy Academy Indonesia. But yeah, let's now move on to the second speakers. Sylvia, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to share some of my insights with you on, and I'm going to share my presentation, which is really about how can governments be held to account for the objectives that they have signed on to in the Paris Agreement. And start just a second. Okay, and then I will do. Oh, sorry. So that's the major question for my presentation. How can states be held to account for reaching the goals of the Paris Agreement? And the first question we have to ask then is, what does it mean? What does the concept of accountability mean? We tend to think it's a good concept. It's a feel-good concept. Who can be against accountability? But what does it actually mean? Because in many languages even, you don't have the word accountability. It's often translated into the word responsibility. So, which would mean that the question is about how can you hold states responsible for that they meet the goals that they have signed in an international legally binding treaty, the Paris Agreement. So in a very simple form, accountability can actually be defined as being about telling a story based on some obligation and with some consequences. But this is always between two groups of people or between two people. So it is a relational concept. It is that someone who has power owes it to the ones that they are ruling for example, in terms of governments, owe it to them to actually justify what they are doing. And if they're not meeting up, acting well enough, that there would be consequences. So if we look at this in more detail, we can think about accountability as being composed about the answer to a number of questions. It is about who should be held to account. So who is responsible? In this case, the governments, for example, who signed the Paris Agreement. It's not only about who is responsible, but also towards whom. The citizens of the countries, in this case, and about what. In our case here, we have the goals of the Paris Agreement, what they want to achieve, and the obligations they have signed on to actually do in that. And then the question is, how can these actors be held to account? How can we ensure that they actually do what they promise to do? And what standards do we use to judge them that they have done enough? For example, in the Paris Agreement, every country has promised to take on its highest possible ambition in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. But it is up to every country to interpret what does highest possible ambitions mean. So that standard is something that then it is for people in that country to judge. Or for people in other countries, of course, that will be wanting all governments to do their very best. And the question is, if you're then trying to hold a country to account, a government, will it have consequences? So if they are not doing enough, if they are not doing what they have promised, will that have any consequences for the governments? And here, we are really talking about accountability for the Paris Agreement, adopted in 2015. And there are many routes actually to hold states to account for their international obligations. And I have here 3 examples. Mostly what we are thinking about is other governments, so that the countries that have signed on to the Paris Agreement, we kind of expect them to hold each other to account. It is an international law, and we tend to expect an international law then to be, well, we tend to expect a law to be enforced, that someone is holding those who have to abide by that law to account. As the story will show, what governments are doing to hold each other to account doesn't really go very far. But we can also look at national institutions that can take a role in this. And this can be, for example, parliaments, who usually, at least in democracies, have the role to hold the government to account for what it does. And it's the parliament that adopt laws. So if national measures to reduce emissions, for example, require laws, it's the parliament's role to adopt those laws. But it can also be a national institution like courts. In the Netherlands, an NGO took the government to court for not doing enough towards its international commitments under the Kyoto Protocol. and it won in court at several levels. You can also, in some countries, there are audit agencies that have a strong role to kind of objectively scrutinize what the government is doing and to provide advice for more effective policies. So in some countries, this is also a route, an institution that can actually hold the government to account. But the route that I will talk a little bit more about later is the publics, and that's really us, youth, you who are following this, people who are engaged about climate change. And that is a very important group to hold the governments to account. Okay, if we look at international laws in general, they are quite different from domestic laws, with the exception for a few international laws with real compliance mechanisms, like in World Trade Organization agreements on free trade. Most international laws actually do not come with enforcement compliance mechanism, and there is no way to enforce their implementation to make sure that countries do what they have promised to do. There is no supranational government. There is no court that will, that you can report the countries to. But rather, most international agreements, particularly in the field of environment and development, have what one can call a very facilitative or encouraging approach to kind of stimulating implementation and compliance. So I will illustrate this in the Paris Agreement. You have the transparency framework that you just heard about. And if you look at the operational rules for this transparency framework, here is a quote to the left on top of the ice bear from the operational rules that were adopted in December last year, that this framework, implementing the transparency framework, should be done in a facilitative, non-intrusive, non-punitive manner, respecting national sovereignty and avoiding placing undue burden on parties. So this is kind of bureaucratic language, but it's basically that you cannot punish any country who cannot comply with the reporting rules under the transparency framework. You should really apply this framework in a very facilitative, in a very encouraging way, helping countries to implement the measures that they are going to do. So it's about, holding out the ones who are doing well and helping others to do as well through various means. So this is really the core dynamics of accountability between states, among all the states who have signed the Paris Agreement. They are trying to kind of, they are very reluctant to even to name and shame those countries who are not doing so much, do not have high ambition, or are not implementing their promised ambition so well. They will rather try and focus on encouraging each other. There is a committee under the Paris Agreement for implementation and compliance, and they will check countries if they have complied with certain specific of the very precise obligations under the Paris Agreement. But if a country cannot follow them, they have only various means to encourage and help the country to do so. Okay, but this was really about how countries, through the transparency framework or this implementation committee, hold each other individually to account, which they do very softly in a very encouraging way. But the Paris Agreement also has a kind of global collective accountability mechanism that I will describe. And this mechanism can actually only work with your help. And I will explain why. This is by many called the ambition mechanism for collective accountability. And this is centered around a process called the global stocktake. So in the Paris Agreement, it says that every 5 years, there will be a process of collecting information from all countries and from non-state actors can also submit information, and from scientists, from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, there will be a lot of information collection, and then all the parties, all the countries who have signed the Paris Agreement will together look at that information and try to judge how far they are from moving towards the objective of the Paris Agreement. And then they will kind of issue a political statement judging how that, summarizing that assessment. And then it says in the Paris Agreement that the outcome of that global stocktake, basically showing at the moment it would show, and I'm sure it will show in 2023 when it will be the first proper global stocktake, that we are very far from being on track to meet the objective. So realizing that, or the outcome of that assessment should, actually it says, shall inform countries' subsequent national determined contributions. So what climate ambition countries have for the next 5 years. So this is where we come in, the citizens of the world, because it only says that countries shall be informed. And then the question is, how are these national ambitions being adopted? Who is deciding about that? And it is very likely that the public and a strong public opinion has a strong influence on that. We can see that in 2018, there was a kind of trial run of the stocktake, and it was called the Talanoa Dialogue. And the hope was, there was this collection of information and political discussion around it. And then the hope was then that countries will use the outcome of that dialogue as motivation for raising their first nationally determined contributions that have to be submitted later this year. And in many cases, this will not happen, indeed, unless there is strong public pressure that is building up. For example, like now in many countries where the youth are taking the lead through school strikes, etc. So this pathway of holding governments to account through you and me is really important. It is not enough. We need lots of other things, and we need to be better, become better as civil society to become more systematic in how we do this, how we expose and share information about how our country is doing, or how poorly or how well it is doing with regard to what we think its responsibility should be to address climate change. So the more hands, the more effective this way of holding governments to account is. And with that, I thank you very much for your attention. And if you have questions after the webinar, you're also most welcome to contact me. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much, yeah. Sylvia.
Yeah, I will. I have to find the. I have to find the way to not share my screen anymore. Sorry.
I think there's a stop sharing options.
Yes, but I have to find the right window first. Oh.
It's also in the screen share, I believe.
Yeah. Yes, now, sorry.
Yes, we have you back.
Okay.
Okay. Okay, that is, yeah, there's also very transparency to accountability, and we're not even addressing a lot about compliance yet, but now there is a question posed already. It is, I don't think, I don't know whether this is for Dedi or for Sylvia, but the question is, how can governments enforce their people to follow their Paris Agreement path or pledge? Up to which limit the government can apply the enforcement law? So probably, yeah, to Dedi first and then to Sylvia to answer this question.
Yeah, thank you, Nila, for the question. I guess how to enforce the government in Indonesia, especially in our cases, it still really persists with the silo working environment. So the ministry is really working their task each other, and they don't really talk each other. So the best way to really enforce the government law, I think, is first to really how they communicate really well together, building the system together, and at the end of the day, the enabling environment should have a strict law to enforce the the policies related to government. In Indonesia currently, and unfortunately, the silo is still persists. So how we can improve is to really have that barrier to be deleted yet. So in terms of the one step closer right now is to how the government really communicate each other really well. I think that's from me.
Yes, and if I should try and answer also, I think this will vary very much with the country. What happens when a country has signed the Paris Agreement is that they have to translate it into a domestic law, so at a law at the national level. So countries will have done that in different ways, and the national laws will look very different. Based on those laws, you can also take different types of policies. So in some countries, for example, they put a carbon tax, or they reduce subsidies on fossil fuels. And depending on the strength of the institutions, is it easy to change tax rates? Is it easy to enforce regulations? Is enough, policy officers who can do this? So that depends on the strength of the administration in different countries, to what degree these kind of regulations can be enforced. And then there's so many different policies that governments can choose to reduce emissions, and some of them will apply to companies, and others may apply to individual citizens. For example, if there are certain rules for how much you can use of certain things, but in many cases the companies are in between, like building codes or rules for transportation.
Okay, so if I can summarize a bit that for DEDI, then its cooperation among relevant institutions needs to be strengthened and work more cooperatively. And for Sylvia, then it's the robustness of regulations, existing regulations, and mainstreaming climate actions in national development planning. And also then it depends on countries' commitment, how to proceed with implementing their pledge.
And their and how strong their institutions are.
As well.
Generally, they may want to very much, but they may, the level of corruption or the weakness of the institutions, of not enough capacity in the administration. There are many reasons why it can be challenging.
Yes. Okay. So while waiting for other questions, I have a question for DEDI.
Yes.
You mentioned about the data and ambition loop. But, what is the next step? Can we ensure the robustness of the data itself, because it has to adhere to the TACCC principles, it's transparent, accurate, comparable, complete, and continuous. And also, what about timeliness? Because Sylvia has shown in one of her slides, there's this timeline for global stocktake and further period. And also about accountability. So has accountability being considered that well, we need to produce more or less accurate data, reliable data, international to be held into account by other governments.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Nila, for the question. Yeah, of course. Right now, the state is obviously in Indonesia still how we encourage the participation of the data submission. But I agree that the data quality itself needs to be submitted, not to mention also the timeliness also. So in that case, I think what Indonesia government and Indonesia countries could do is actually to really leverage the potential of the existing initiatives globally that unfortunately, Indonesia is still not available. I mentioned about the initiatives like science-based target and also carbon disclosure project that has been worked really well in the other countries like Japan, for example, really implementing their science-based target and also TCFD and also CDPs into their long-term strategies. And that also help in the accountability as well, because those frameworks also really have a set of standards. And as I mentioned also, the Indonesia still have a gap in the capacity building and also financial. So those right now, I think the best idea is to both encourage and really leveraging the existing initiatives in global to be implemented in Indonesia.
Okay. We have more questions for Dedi here.
Okay.
Yes, it's at the YouTube channel from Himayatus Salihah. The question is, what motivates companies in Indonesia to conduct multiple reporting process in different platforms?
Okay, a good question. So thank you for asking. First thing first, I think there are two motives, I guess, how they really need to submit some of the multiple reporting process. First is the company's value or also reputation itself. Of course, the companies will have the tendency to really compete with each other and also attract more investor. So based on the reporting system, especially if you have proper platform in the Ministry of Forestry and Environment, you'll have some ranking system. So if you have specific criteria, you will have a gold rating system. You have a green reporting system that will also increase the company's overall image to the public. The second one is, of course, the different in the level of mandatory reporting system. Those 5 reporting system both have its own mandatory. Not all of them mandatory, some of them also voluntary also. So that might also increase the idea of the reporting system for some countries. And of course, there should be some incentive mechanism also that needs to be done for the companies to be able to have a reporting system in overall. So I think those two things are the main idea how to the companies conduct multiple reporting system. But of course, as I said, to really increase the idea on how increasing the climate action, there needs to be single reporting system that now is being developed.
Okay. So there's a question now for Sylvia. Before, the question is how countries or government can enforce their citizen, but it's now the other way around. Especially for Indonesia, perhaps you have an example of how public or youth can hold the government into account if they are upholding their climate ambition.
Well, I think that the most important thing is to be engaged. So the people and youth to follow the issue, to organize, to inform themselves of what are the obligations under the Paris Agreement, and to compare that with what is Indonesia promising to do. It takes a lot of skill and expertise to follow the very technical aspects of, for example, transparency. So there might be some specialized NGOs that do that, like WRI. But I think in general, what all of us can do, and especially youth, is to have conversations with each other and with their parents and with their peers and with their colleagues, because it is really a widespread common aim that is transmitted through social media, through traditional media. You can write debate articles, perhaps, or through various ways, show that the younger generation both are aware that or is of the opinion, that the government perhaps is not doing enough. I mean, I cannot judge that from here, but that there's someone who is watching the government, that they are paying attention to what they do and particularly what they do not do. if they're failing to do enough. But I think also it's important that the youth then also show the way by their own actions, that they are also willing to sacrifice things, that they're willing to sacrifice certain aspects of a fossil fuel-based lifestyles, that they are willing to do these things. Because one of the things that governments that are elected are afraid of is that their measures will be unpopular. And for example, if they reduce fossil fuel subsidies, and they need to have a lot of ideas and a lot of public support, and particularly ideas on how to do it without hurting those who are poorest, how to do it in a way that is fair. And there are lots of need for these creative ideas of how to do that in a society. So both not only kind of raising the voices and saying we're watching you, but also coming with concrete ideas and also showing the way that we are willing to live differently.
Yes. Okay, thank you so much, Sylvia. And there's another question for Daddy from Nathan Foxwell. Building transparency system and engaging companies can take time. It is a process over years. Are there lessons Indonesia has been able to learn from other countries, especially in the region?
Okay. So yeah, thank you for the question, Nathan. So for Indonesia, I think the best way to engage the private sector right now is to leverage the business association related with each of the sector. For example, best case scenario in Indonesia is the cement sector. They have a really good transparency, and also how they mitigate and also how they measure the the emissions, greenhouse gas emissions is really good, and they have a really good connection with each other also. So cement is one of the sector in Indonesia that really proved to be the one who really commit to the greenhouse gas reporting system. So leveraging the overall association is really a good example, and other countries like Japan also have been able to really reach out the private sector in a short time manner by engaging the association. Such as in Japan, they have a business federation that holds a really strong, leadership in the climate change. So yeah, engaging in the association will obviously take more time with less effort and also more impact overall. I think that's my answer.
Okay, thank you, Daddy. And also from Nathan to Sylvia. In your experience, or are you aware, are there lessons the Paris Agreement accountability or compliance regime can learn from other multilateral agreements?
That's always helpful to learn from others. And I think, in one sense, it has learned from its own history, because the Kyoto Protocol had a kind of enforcement mechanism. It had a compliance mechanism even with sanctions for the industrialized countries who had obligations to reduce emissions. So it was only for industrialized countries. However, when one country was coming close to being found to be non-compliant, Canada, it left the agreement. So in one sense, that shows that countries do find it a bit shameful to be found like breaking international law, but it also illustrates that anyone can leave anytime. This is this is how international law is designed at the moment, that it is really voluntary to be bound by that law. And so and countries, they were, since now the Paris Agreement was going to be universal and covering also developing countries, there were both certain, very specific industrialized countries and certain in developing countries that were extremely resisting. They refused to have a compliance mechanism or something like that, to have binding that kind of enforcement mechanism, because they're very sensitive about their sovereignty. So that was like the lesson they had to learn from the previous agreement, that in order to be able to be universal, that it would cover all countries, they could not use that kind of compliance mechanism. And on the other hand, that compliance mechanism, even though it was the strongest that the climate regime had seen, still didn't help if a country really doesn't want to be part of it. US left the Kyoto Protocol, and then Canada left later. So, but there are, for example, in the human rights regime, I think that is an interesting model which has more elements of civil society participation in the transparency framework, actually, and stronger role from civil society to be part of information gathering and have a stronger voice to actually shame or praise countries with regard to their commitments. And I have been asked this before, like, so why was this not part of the Paris Agreement? And that is not because there was no one who wasn't trying to get that part of the Paris Agreement, or to get that kind of more civil society participation. It is often NGOs who work in both spaces. But it was just too politically unpopular by many countries. So because countries are so reluctant, they hide behind national sovereignty to make these agreements stronger. They only do so in trade, where they see the economic value so strong to do that. And that is why I argue that our role in civil society and our role in our domestic context is so much stronger. We cannot rely on enforcement mechanism in the global regime. We have to do it ourselves at home.
Okay, thank you, Sylvia. Very clear answer. And there's another question from Freza Zarzamora. It doesn't say where to whom it is addressed to, but the question is, where do grassroots activities, for example, local climate banks, fit into transparency and accountability to be counted into the national climate actions? Because they may not have access to information or data. Probably Dedi first, and Sylvia then.
Yeah. For me, that's a really good question, because the grassroots activities, of course, it's also included like the small and medium enterprise, like the small companies really don't have any say in the overall climate policy. And that's not good also, because there's so many SMI in Indonesia that also contribute to the overall climate action. So the key for me, from my side, I think, is to really how we engage them, to how engage them. And in this case, the question is that they may not have access to the info or the data. I think the best way is how we engage them, what are they need in terms of the climate action, and in terms of that one, how we really disseminate the result of the system to them, how we really can help the info or the data. And also in PASTI approach itself, we will have also the project about pilot implementation. So we will approach some of the companies, as I mentioned also, that will be asked about what's their opinion about the system that we will build in the future, One Gate reporting system. We will, approach both of the big players and small players. Small players in this case, I think, is the one that being mentioned in the question, like the grassroots activities like local climate banks. So hopefully by developing the systems that are, universally being accepted by both big players and small players, the gap in this case, like the access to the info or the data, will be closed, so that the grassroots activities can be fitted into the national action plan.
Okay, thank you, Dedi. Sylvia,
Yes.
you have other example, or you want to add to that?
Yes, I can add a little bit. I do think that if you're a small grassroots organization, and if you're still not part of a, generating data about your activity, that you're not actively part of the transparency framework, obviously that doesn't have to stop you from acting. And I do think that for most of us, particularly in our neighborhoods, in our families, it is very helpful to have, to go through an app, finding out your carbon footprint, in order to understand which of my activities in my life contributes most to climate change, or which of the activities in my football organization or whatever. So data is important for that. But we also have rather general knowledge. We know, that it comes from fossil fuels. So if we learn the basic cause-effect relationships, we can also just realize that reducing fossil fuel use, planting trees, as much as possible. We don't have to count everything we do. It still helps the climate. And we all know that we just all have to do as much as we can. So just start acting and don't wait for it to be measured.
Okay. Yes. So now we are nearing the end of the sessions. We have very good questions, but if I would like to conclude for our session here that whether you're grassroots or just an individual, you can always, in this time, of course, you can find information and data easily regarding your own footprints, like Sylvia said, and also about, for Indonesia, the government's commitment in general, just search for national determined contribution of Indonesia. And then you can find out how the regulations of or the target is distributed among sectors and also at local levels. And the data is being improved right now currently with the help of PASTI. So yeah, there are many ways to help upholding transparency and accountability. But yeah, I have one last question, but this is just like, I don't know if we can answer it. It's just that then does transparency reduce or reinforce accountability? I mean by that is that reducing through the so many procedural and capacity barriers, especially for developing countries, but also in reinforcing, can we or should we name and shame our own governments or other governments or leaders in the world who are not walking their talk, if it's not by sanction, of course. So we have no more questions, and it's been an hour of fruitful discussion, very enlightening question and answer sessions. I would like to thank you both, Dedi and Sylvia. And the next webinar will be held on 31st of July. The topic is energy transition, and it will be led by Kamia Handayani from University of Twente. So thank you once again to both speakers, to Energy Academy Indonesia and TUI Consultants, and also to all audience from all around the world. Thank you for active participation, and we hope that this session will be useful and insightful. And until next opportunities. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.